Have you ever walked past some old derelict factory or maybe an abandoned hospital and just found yourself wondering what stories are hiding inside those crumbling walls? Well, today we're going to take a journey right into that world. We're talking about urban exploration, or as it's better known, urbex. It's basically a deep dive into all the hidden, forgotten, and yes, strictly off-limits parts of the world we've built around us. I mean, listen to that. More therapeutic than years and years of therapy. That quote from an explorer, it really gets to the absolute heart of this whole thing, doesn't it? For so many people, urbex isn't just a hobby. It's not just about getting an adrenaline rush. It's a deeply personal quest. Think about it. We live in a world that feels so mapped out, so controlled. Urbex is about finding those last few spaces that are still wild and untamed. It's about finding, I don't know, a kind of salvation, a bit of inspiration in the darkness of these decaying places. It really taps into that deep human need we all have for just pure, unscripted discovery. All right, so here's the roadmap for today. First, we're going to dig into the allure of these ruins. Why are we so drawn to them? Then we'll get practical and look at an explorer's toolkit. After that, things get a little sticky with the law, trespassing, and its consequences. We'll also tackle a really tricky situation involving a researcher. And finally, we'll zoom all the way out to think about the philosophy of decay itself. Let's get into it. Okay, first up, the allure of ruin. So, what is it? What's the magnetic pull that draws people toward these derelict and, let's be honest, often really dangerous buildings? It's not just one thing, right? It's this complex cocktail of history, a unique kind of beauty, and a really powerful taste for the forbidden. So let's get a solid definition on the table. At its most basic, urbex is recreational trespass, but it's so much more than that. According to the people who do it, you need a pretty specific mindset. You need a little bit of claustrophobia, a love for tight spaces. You absolutely cannot be afraid of heights, so zero vertigo. You need a genuine appreciation for decay and a real fascination with all the hidden machinery and infrastructure that makes our world actually run. I mean, just think about that for a second. These are the places where society's forgotten stories are literally just sitting there, waiting. To really get why these ruins are so compelling, you have to understand where they come from. And the story of asylums is a perfect and pretty tragic example. I mean, they started out as these hopeful sanctuaries back in the 18th century. The idea was moral treatment, that you could actually restore people's minds. This led to the Kirkbride Plan, these enormous, almost palatial institutions that were meant to be self-sustaining utopias. But then, well, after the Civil War, things took a dark turn. Overcrowding, no funding, that whole idea of moral treatment just went out the window. They became warehouses for people. The dream completely died, and these massive, once grand buildings were just left to rot. And that's the key takeaway here. A lot of the time, the places explorers are drawn to are basically monuments to our own social and political failures. Now, it's super important to know that the urbex world isn't just one big group of people. It's actually made up of all these different subscenes, each with their own vibe. First, you've got the ruinistas. These are the folks who are there for the poetry of it all, the peeling paint, the haunting atmosphere, the quiet stories in the dust. Then you have the adventurers. They're all about the thrill, the adrenaline, and getting that one perfect epic photograph. The hero shot, you know the one, them standing on top of a crane against the skyline. And then there are the guerrilla preservationists. These explorers see themselves as archivists almost. They're creating a record of these buildings before they vanish forever. And finally, you have the infiltrators. These are kind of the avant-garde of the scene. They're not interested in ruins. They're all about the challenge of getting into super secure live sites. Think subway tunnels or skyscrapers that are still being built. All right, so we've talked about the why, but let's get into the how. Because believe me, exploring these places is not just a casual stroll. It takes gear, it takes guts, and it definitely takes a little bit of guile. So what does it take to explore a war zone or just a derelict building? This question comes straight from a debate inside the community, and it perfectly captures this huge argument they're always having. Like, how much gear do you really need? Are you just going for a look-see, or are you prepping for a full-on Black Ops mission? The opinions are all over the place, and man, people get passionate about it. And when you look at what some explorers carry, you see just how serious this can get. We're talking hard hats for, falling chunks of ceiling, P100 respirators for all the nasty stuff in the air, asbestos, black mold, even something called pigeon lung. Then you've got heavy-duty boots with steel plates inside so you don't step on a rusty nail. But it gets even more intense. We're talking full first aid and even trauma kits, with tourniquets in case of a really bad injury from rebar or broken glass. And maybe the most important piece of gear of all? An urbex buddy. Going alone is the one thing almost everyone agrees is a massive, huge no-no. So this really shows you the two extremes of that whole gear debate. On one side, you've got the ultra-prepared explorer, kitted out like they're ready for anything. And on the other side, you've got the minimalists, the folks who say, look, all you really need is a good flashlight and maybe a knife. But my favorite approach has to be the one that relies on pure confidence. There's this one explorer who talked about getting by with just an important-looking clipboard and what he called phenomenal BS. His whole philosophy was, if you act like you're supposed to be there, nobody will ever question you. Sometimes a little bit of cleverness is your best tool. But here's the thing. You can have all the best gear in the world, prepare for every physical danger, but every single time you go out, you're crossing a major line. And that's the legal one, which brings us to the messy, complicated labyrinth of trespass and what can happen when you get caught. So let's be clear about what we're talking about. What is trespass, legally speaking? Well, at its base level, it's a civil offense. That just means you're on someone's property without their permission. But, and this is a big but, it's not always that simple. It can get escalated to a criminal offense real fast. For example, trespassing on an active railway, that's criminal because you're endangering the entire network, not just yourself. And in some places, even just snapping photos without permission can push it over that line from a civil issue to a criminal one. And property owners have a whole playbook for how to respond. It usually starts simple, more fences, better locks, maybe some cameras or security patrols. If that doesn't stop people, they can go to court and get a civil injunction. And here's where it gets really serious. They can get an injunction against persons unknown. That's a powerful legal tool that means the order applies to anyone who might trespass in the future, even if they've never been there before. And if you get caught breaking that court order, well, you're not in civil court anymore. You're facing criminal charges. We're talking potential prison time. Now, faced with all these legal risks, the urbex community has tried to create its own code of conduct. You can see it in the rules of online forums. There's a big emphasis on self-policing. Things like no promoting theft. The classic motto is take only pictures, leave only footprints. And here's the big one. Do not share spots or locations. This isn't just about being secretive for the sake of it. It's actually a conservation principle. The second a cool location gets blasted all over the internet, it gets overrun, it gets vandalized, and then inevitably it gets sealed up tight or demolished. So that secrecy is about protecting the places themselves. All right, this next part gets really complicated. We're going to dive into a case study that completely blurs the lines between doing academic research, actually being part of a group, and, well, committing crimes. And it brings up this huge, thorny question. Can you actually study a subculture like this without becoming part of the problem yourself? So let me introduce you to Bradley Garrett. He's an ethnographer who, for his PhD, went deep undercover with a group of urban explorers in London. And his whole argument was this. To truly understand a group like this, to do what academics call participant observation, you can't just be a fly on the wall. He argued that to do real, meaningful research, you might actually have to break the law right alongside the people you're studying. As you can imagine, this set off a massive ethical firestorm. On one hand, you have the argument for full immersion. Garrett's point is that in these kinds of groups, if you're just a passive observer, you'll be ignored. To get real access, to gain their trust, you have to play by their rules, even if that means breaking the law. But the counterargument is just as powerful. If you have academics out there committing crimes, you risk damaging the reputation of your university, your entire field of study, and you could seriously undermine the public's trust in scientific research. It's a huge dilemma.
And then came this is like the knockout punch. And it didn't come from a professor in an ivory tower. It came from one of the other explorers in Garrett's own crew. He said, Brad, you didn't integrate yourself into the culture. You created the culture so that you would have something to study. Oof. I mean, that is a devastating accusation, right? It cuts right to the heart of this whole problem. Was he just documenting what was happening? Or was he the one making it happen? Was he a scribe? Or was he a ringleader?
And that just leaves us hanging with this really tough, unresolved question. It's something researchers have struggled with for decades, but it's so much sharper here. When you're studying a group that operates outside the law, where do you draw the line between just observing and actively participating? Is it even possible to get close enough to understand a culture like this without changing it forever? Okay, for this last section, let's pull the camera way back. Let's move beyond the practical and the ethical and get a little philosophical. Because the fact that these ruins even exist and the fact that we're so fascinated by them forces us to ask a much bigger question about how we think about history, memory, and preservation. And that brings us to this really fascinating, kind of radical idea from a professor named Kaelin De Silvi. It's called curated decay. And what it does is it completely challenges the number one rule of heritage preservation, which is that we have to fight decay at all costs. She says, wait a minute. What if instead we actively manage the process of decay? What if we let these places transform naturally and see that transformation as part of their ongoing story? The process she talks about is called adaptive release, and it's super important to understand this isn't about just neglecting a place and letting it fall apart. No, it's a conscious, deliberate choice to let it go. It's about recognizing that as a building decays and nature starts to move back in, a totally new kind of meaning can be born. You get this blend of ecological and cultural value. So, for instance, when a colony of bats moves into a ruined church, they're not destroying the heritage, they're becoming part of the church's new story. So here it is, the two philosophies, side by side. On one side, you have traditional preservation. The goal there is to freeze a moment in time, to fight decay, and keep a building exactly as it was, forever. On the other side, you have adaptive release, and its goal is to embrace change as part of the story. It lets nature write the next chapter. It's a fundamental shift from thinking about preservation to thinking about process. And that brings us to our final and maybe most challenging question. When we look at these ruins all around us, whether we're an urban explorer, a historian, or just someone curious walking by, what is our real responsibility to the past? Do we owe these places an endless, expensive fight against time itself, or do we owe them something else? Maybe the grace of a dignified, meaningful end. Something to think about.